Thanks, Gus, and safe travels and be safe in Florida. So great to be here to represent Red Hat as a headline sponsor. It's the first time we've sponsored NGINX conference. So great to be here. I'll be here for a couple of days, so hopefully I'll be able to catch up with a few of you as well and talk one-on-one. As Gus said, we've had a long partnership and collaboration with NGINX over the years, and this idea of collaboration is really what I want to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so. But before I do, I want to wake everybody up with a bit of audience participation. Now, I'm not going to do some kind of crazy hypnosis thing on stage, so don't worry. I'm just going to do some kind of straw polls with a show of hands, just to understand a little bit more about the audience I'm talking to. So I assume you're all NGINX users or customers. So aside from NGINX, raise your hands if your organization uses open source in your environments, your projects, your products. So I'd say, from my view, that's probably about 83.5%. Could be, give or take. Raise your hands again if you actively contribute to open source, whether it be pull requests, organizing meetups, bitching on mail lists, any kind of collaboration with open source projects. Raise your hands. Okay, it's kind of what I expected. That's definitely above average. I think it's a pretty enlightened audience here. Final question from my sponsor. Hands up if you use Red Hat technologies, whether commercial products or open source projects upstream. Okay, that's about right. Later in the coffee break, I'll be outside with a pile of business cards and a leaf blower if you want to come talk to me about changing that situation. Okay, so if you believe you're not using open source, you may well be wrong. You may well be using it without knowing it. People who work for you may well be using it without you knowing it. But by 2015, 2016, I think everybody kind of agreed that open source had become mainstream, and this kind of open source movement and way of developing software had won. If you're not using open source today, you're probably in a very, very specialized industry where maybe it hasn't kind of encroached yet, or you're making a mistake and you're falling behind your competitors. While open source or the idea of free and open software has been around since the 1950s, it really took off in the 1980s. And the 1990s, as the software movement really kind of, the free software movement really started to establish itself, and we started to establish formal legal licenses for open source. And during the dot-com boom, kind of mid and late 90s, open source software for the dot-com boom was really like picks and shovels for the gold rush, right? It's some of the technology that powered some of the huge big pushes around innovation, innovative ideas and business models. So it really kind of took off in the last 15, 20 years. Initially, open source was seen as maybe an inferior alternative to a proprietary technology that existed. The first versions of Linux certainly weren't as secure or robust as, say, something like Solaris or VMS. I don't think anybody would doubt that. I suspect the first versions of Apache Web Server and NGINX weren't as feature-rich or as well-integrated as some of the technologies they were replacing. And certainly the first versions of JBoss were nowhere near as polished or as easy to use as products like WebSphere WebLogic. But if you look at the landscape now, Linux is still here. Solaris, not so much. NGINX is taken off extremely rapidly. And JBoss and Red Hat and middleware is really taken off as well. So I think that really kind of marked the first phase of open source. It was seen as an alternative to proprietary technologies, And people would give it some slack. Early adopters of open source would cut it some slack because they really valued the flexibility and freedom that open source provided. But in the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years maybe, I think we've seen open source enter a new phase. I think right now, if you're a technologist, all of the really cool stuff happening today in software is happening in open source communities, and I've listed a fraction of some of those. Whether you're doing artificial intelligence, machine learning, distributed ledger, web, social, mobile, cloud, microservices, you're likely touching open source, and you're likely turning to open source technologies to really kind of lead the way with some of these things. We've hit an inflection point where even organizations like Microsoft, who for many, many decades really were fairly anti-open source. I think they use the word cancer, which is kind of harsh. Who now have fully embraced open source, both internally and if you're an Azure customer, you'll notice they support all of the kind of common open source stacks. And they've also open sourced some of their core technology, .NET Core, the Chakra JavaScript engine, to name a few. So I don't believe that's just a marketing trick. I think they truly have changed and truly have embraced open source. So we've kind of gone through this inflection with open source. So open source is one. I think by many it's seen as not a risky solution, but actually a lower risk solution today. If you see what's happened with Oracle's acquisition of Sun in the last week or so, open source can transcend organizations and companies. Solaris in some form will live on long after Oracle decide to stop supporting it. Jenkins has a long, long life ahead of it, way after Oracle essentially turned its back on it. So I think open source for many organizations 10 years ago was seen as risky. Now I think it's becoming the solution for the risk averse. So that's a big change. And open source has gone beyond its software roots. We have open source electronics. We have open source automotive. Elon Musk, back in 2014, basically made a very strong statement that they would not use their patent portfolio to stop competitors progressing in the EV space. They would only use them in defensive situations. My CEO wrote a book about the open organization, how you can use open and agile principles to change your organization to be, evolve more rapidly and be more responsive to change in the market. We even have, huge community around open source beer, which combines two of my favorite things, and be happy to kind of discuss some of that later if you're still around. So. And Red Hat's history is really interleaved with the modern history of open source, at least since the 1990s. Founded in 1993, we've, I think, along with the growth and acceptance of open source in the enterprise, our portfolio has grown. We've done that by joining communities, getting involved in communities, and also through acquisitions. I think we were certainly not the only open source company to see the advantage around adopting the open source model. Many other organizations have, like NGINX. But we certainly one of the first, certainly one of the most aggressive in truly adopting the open source DNA. So we've acquired numerous companies. And whether we acquired them because the enterprise need was there, or whether we created the enterprise need because we expanded our portfolio and made it safer to deploy open source middleware or storage or API management is TBD. We've been through intense growth in the last 4 or 5 years with acquisitions, CentOS, which gave us much kind of deeper developer community around Linux. Intank, so we can start thinking about software-defined storage. Enavance, a consulting company, gave us deep expertise in OpenStack, an important technology for us. Feed Henry for mobile and Node.js and JavaScript. Ansible acquired a couple of years ago. And then the most recent was 3Scale around API management. And 3Scale, by the way, are also use NGINX in their product. So Red Hat has very few secrets. We're a very open company. When all of your intellectual property is in public GitHub repos, it's kind of hard to have too many secrets. Everything we do tends to be fairly public. So I'm kind of going to let you into some of the things we've done at Red Hat over the last 20 so years to be successful. And these are things that you may want to think about in your organization because while we're a software vendor and many of you are kind of end customers, our lives really aren't that different. So the kind of main principles are that we participate in literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of upstream, what we call upstream projects. That participation is essential for us. It allows us to truly understand the community dynamics, where the technology is heading, and really helps us to understand how to support those technologies with real customer use cases. So getting involved upstream is super important to us. Not all vendors will necessarily do that. So we make investments. We have something like 2,000 to 3,000 engineers, and we have to choose wisely where we deploy these engineers. We have to look at projects, see what their needs are, and really see how Red Hat can help support those technologies. Quite often, the upstream projects are really just small features. They aren't. They're just a part of an overall solution set. So one of the other values we provide is to integrate those technologies to form a true solution. Red Hat Enterprise Linux is literally made of tens of thousands of individual projects, all of them important in their own right. But only when you pull them together do they really solve some really valuable customer problems. So integrating those technologies with quality and performance is super important. And then finally, we have to stabilize. Open source is always presented a dichotomy to users that you want the bleeding edge technology, you want things moving quickly and fast, your developers love the latest and greatest. But as ops people, we don't want surprises, we don't want things to break, we want stability in our data centers. So over the years, we've developed ways to ensure we do tons of testing and certification and regression testing and load testing and destruction testing to ensure that release to release, we don't break things for our valuable customers. I suspect this is not vastly different from many other organizations. I think where Red Hat maybe goes beyond other companies and how it feels different from other companies is the way we've adopted the open source culture. And there are a couple of big ones I'd like to talk about as it relates to culture. This idea of collaboration is super important. We often have a little bit too much collaboration at Red Hat. The mailing lists do tend to get out of control occasionally, but people are passionate. They want to have their voices heard, and they want to discuss decisions and be part of the decision-making process. So collaboration definitely part of our DNA. There are really no projects that Red Hat can't approach and say, hey, we would like to get involved and help out. We're generally welcomed with open arms. Transparency, again, it's very, very different as a very open organization with all of our intellectual property in public GitHub repos not to be transparent. We kind of have to. It'd be far too easy to call us out if we weren't. And then the other one is diversity. It's super important when you're solving any kind of problem to have a diverse set of opinions and inputs. Having like minds solve a problem doesn't always give you the best solution. But if you bring people in from different backgrounds, different industries, different use cases, different geographies, different genders, you are likely going to get a better solution, a more rounded solution. People are going to ask the right kinds of questions and question some of the architecture. So that diversity is super important. And I suspect that's one of the reasons many organizations take existing technology and push it into open source communities, like Google did with Kubernetes. One of the reasons to do that was to get a much more diverse design thinking going to make it much more broadly applicable. So there are things that the open source communities do really, really well. Open source communities tend to build really, really good, solid, reliable engines. They tend to, rapidly iterate on problems, rapidly discard bad solutions. So there's kind of a Darwinian filter aspect to all of this. You tend to get great minds involved in open source. I've worked for much bigger companies than Red Hat, and whatever company you work for, however big and powerful, most of the smart people do not work for you. They work for somebody else. They work outside. So if you can somehow embrace that, that's a real advantage. Things that open source communities aren't necessarily good at, and where we often, Red Hat and NGINX, I suspect, and also other large vendors have to step in, are building great user experiences. Again, that's a discipline that really needs training and experience. We've built our own user experience group within Red Hat over the last 5 years. If you compare something like RHEL 6 to OpenShift v3, you'll see a huge difference in the approach we've taken around user experience. So that's really something that you need an organization to invest some real expertise and human power into it. Some of the testing and certification we do, that's not super exciting. People upstream in upstream open source communities aren't necessarily interested in doing 508 compliance or filling out export control forms or doing SOAP testing. So that's often something large vendors and certainly Red Hat has to do. We have the horsepower, we have the people, we can rally the resources to do some of that huge scale testing that is needed. And then finally, providing that predictability and stability around these fairly rapidly moving open source streams is something we provide as well. For a couple of things I want you to understand about Red Hat, we are not just the Linux company. We haven't been just the Linux company for 15 years. Over the years, as I've said, we've expanded as open source has been adopted in more areas within the enterprise. So we've expanded our portfolio of products. For every product we have, there are one or more upstream projects, and literally thousands of these projects feed into our products. So just that kind of coordination and the engineering discipline required to do that is pretty mind-boggling as we grow. But Red Hat's not just an open source company. First and foremost, it's an enterprise software company. We just happen to believe in open source, and we just happen to have been involved in open source for longer than most companies. But at the end of the day, we are an enterprise software company. People buy subscriptions from us because they trust in our technology. That's an important word, trust. So every industry and every country has chosen Red Hat's portfolio, not just because they're open, but because they're tried, tested, and trusted. We're now a large company. I joined 10 years ago. We were only 1,500 employees. We're now 11,000 in 85 offices in 35 countries. We hit the $2 billion mark in revenue. I hope we'll be the first open source company to hit $5 and $10 billion as well. But if there are a couple of things I can leave you with to take away from this is, it's not just about the technology. We provide subscriptions. That was an area of innovation. subscription that takes the technology, patch streams, support, legal indemnification, and the upstream expertise that you can't get anywhere else. That's the thing you pay for. It's a very, very nice business model. Most organizations prefer that over buying shelfware. And I'll kind of leave you with a couple of thoughts. We're here all week, so come out and talk to some of our product experts in the community hall. Help talk to them. Let us help you kind of reach your digital transformation goals with open source. And the other thing I would encourage is think about we are in this open source era. Open source has won. How do you as individuals or as organizations want to be involved with open source? Do you want to sit on the sidelines as just a passive consumer? Or do you want to get involved and help drive some of the directions? And there's little things you can do. Many companies have open source policies about how and where they can use open source technology, how people can get involved in open source communities. If you're an organization that has lots of developers, ensure you have a policy so your developers can understand how they can be involved with open source projects. Because I guarantee your smartest engineers are probably already doing it. So, many enlightened customers are using open source collaboration as a retention and recruitment tool. So, with that, thanks for listening. Again, I'm here all week. I have another talk this afternoon. I'll be talking about some of the things you've heard on stage about the kind of changing nature of application platforms and application development. So feel free to come along but above all, enjoy the week and learn as much as you can. And thank you.